I recently had to hear a tragic life story from colleagues. Hey, I'm Detective Brooks from the city of Kenton, Ohio. Although I did not personally participate in the investigation of this case, I consider it necessary to share it with you, as it deserves your attention. Many of us are familiar with youthful mistakes and doubts when choosing a life path. Something similar happened to the heroine of today's story, who could not define her own feelings. She was too young to realize how risky love triangles can be. Unfortunately, the girl did not have time to grasp this. Kayley Mundadee was only 19 years old, and she was a second-year student at Trinity University in San Antonio, Texas, USA. She was in a romantic relationship with a 22-year-old man named Mark Howerton. At the same time, Kayley found herself faced with a difficult choice, as in addition to Mark, she continued to maintain a connection with her ex-boyfriend Jett Burcham. Kayley had previously dated him, and even after meeting Mark, she wavered between these two young men for a long time. You can't even imagine how fatal this reckless love triangle turned out to be for her. On October 29, 2017, Kayley, along with her boyfriend Mark Howerton, attended the annual music festival in San Antonio. There, the lovers drank alcohol, smoked marijuana, and then mutually decided to make love in the car. After that, the girl unexpectedly passed out. Mark, noticing that she was not breathing, quickly put her in the car and rushed her to the nearest hospital. It seemed nothing unusual, right? But no, my dears, everything turned out to be extremely tragic. If you're interested in learning about this horrific incident, be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new videos. This will greatly support me as an author. The doctors made every effort, using various methods and equipment, to save Kayley's life. Unfortunately, this was unsuccessful. The doctors were forced to declare the death of the 19-year-old cheerleader Kayley Mundadee due to the injuries sustained, and the girl had many injuries. When Kayley's mother first saw her daughter in the hospital, it even seemed to her that she had been hit by a train or a truck, or that she had fallen from a plane, so mutilated was the girl's body. There was practically no uninjured spot on her. When the victim was brought to the hospital, her condition was extremely serious. The doctors performed artificial respiration at least 7 times, and they managed to start her heart. However, each time after that, it unfortunately stopped. Kayley fell into a deep coma, so initially the doctors connected her to life support systems. The fight for the girl's life lasted 2 days, but eventually it became clear that Kayley's brain was dead. The doctors had to inform her parents that there was no hope for recovery. For this reason, the decision was made to disconnect the girl from the artificial ventilation system. Unfortunately, this tragic decision was the most difficult thing Kayley's parents could experience in their lives, but despite this, her relatives insisted that her last wish must be fulfilled. Kayley had always wanted her organs to be donated to save other people's lives in case of such a tragedy. Her mother was constantly in the ward, and until the very end did not believe in the reality of what was happening. But unfortunately, it was true. According to the forensic expert's conclusion, the cause of death was a traumatic brain injury. The deceased was found to have a fractured skull and elbow bone, resulting from blows with a blunt object. In addition, the cheerleader's body was so mutilated that her relatives simply refused to believe that a human being could have done such a thing. It rather seemed as though the girl had been in some terrible accident or was killed by a maniac. You know, in my practice I've seen a lot of bloody cases, but looking at the photos from the hospital, my blood just runs cold. Unfortunately, I can't show them to you due to YouTube's policy. This is a very sad case because at the time of the tragedy, Kayley had just turned 19. She was a second-year student at Trinity University, where she studied public relations. Kayley was a bright, popular, and respected girl in the university's female community. She was a cheerleader, easily made friends, was sociable, and naturally fit into any company. People were drawn to her. According to Kayley's best friend, the girl was interested not only in studying, but also in building a personal life and enjoyed entertainment. Her whole life was ahead of her. Immediately after entering the university, Kayley fell in love with her first boyfriend, Jett Burcham. He became her first and only truly strong feeling that she could not forget. The young people met in their first year. The guy was a talented athlete, and they immediately felt an attraction. The girl called him her dream and was incredibly proud of their relationship. However, in the opinion of the deceased's mother, it was a typical teenage love. The couple occasionally had arguments, and their feelings would flare up and die down with new intensity. By the second year, Kayley was already convinced that Jett shared her plans for the future to get married and have children. But then the girl began to realize that the guy took life too lightly and did not think about the future prospects. When Kayley became aware of this, she decided to move on. It was at this time that the girl met Mark Howerton. He did not study at Trinity University but was visiting friends there. An immediate mutual attraction arose between Cayley and Mark. They got along wonderfully and started dating. But the girl was unable to completely break off contact with Jett. Thus, she effectively found herself in a relationship with two guys at the same time. This became her fatal mistake. Moreover, both young men knew about Cayley's affairs. It seemed as though the girl had arranged some kind of competition or race where she intended to choose the better of them. But for obvious reasons, both guys were categorically against Cayley's experiments and tried in every way to get her to make a final choice. But the young people did not have time to resolve this conflict. Literally a month after the second suitor appeared, the girl ended up in the hospital with injuries incompatible with life. He brought her there in his car around 10:30 p.m. on October 29, 2017. While the doctors were fighting for the victim's life, the police were already talking to 22-year-old Mark. For this, they took him to the most secluded place they could find in the hospital, the chapel there. According to Mark, the couple spent a weekend at the music festival in San Antonio, where they drank alcohol and smoked marijuana. The police found out that such a recreation scenario was a common thing for them. Further, as Mark reported, approximately between 5 and 6 p.m. they went for a ride in his Mercedes. During this trip, an argument flared up between the lovers. Cayley confessed that she still had feelings for her ex-boyfriend Jett. Mark apparently tried to convince her to break up with her ex-boyfriend and stop any communication with his company. Eventually, he managed to calm Cayley down, and she agreed to think about his words. Later, Mark continued. The couple stopped at a deserted parking lot near a gas station, where they engaged in intimate relations. According to the guy, their sex was rough. He claimed that he strangled the girl, slapped her in the face, but assured that Cayley liked it. She enjoyed intense sensations. Despite numerous attempts by the police to latch onto the facts stated by Mark, he steadfastly stood his ground, claiming that everything happened by mutual consent. Was it really like that? Unfortunately, it turned out not to be so simple. Events unfolded not according to the usual scenario. As Mark reported, after sex, he and Cayley talked for about 5 more minutes, and then the girl started complaining of a headache. But the guy did not attach much importance to it, attributing it to an excess of alcohol. When a few seconds later, Cayley suddenly passed out and started snoring, Mark still did not sound the alarm. He allegedly decided to take the girl to his apartment in Houston because he thought she had just fallen asleep under the influence of fatigue, alcohol, and drugs. At some point, Cayley stopped snoring and stopped showing any signs of life at all. That's when the young man became worried. Mark tried to feel for a pulse, but it seemed to him that there was none, and he did not notice any breathing. Only after that did the guy rush to the hospital. Mark claimed to be extremely worried, concerned about Cayley's condition, and hurried to try to save her life. The detectives who began investigating this incident had no doubt that the girl's horrific body condition was the result of a vicious attack. They interrogated Mark several times, but there was nothing to latch onto. The only inconsistency that immediately caught the eye was the indication of where the car was located. At first, Mark reported that he and Cayley had spent time at a gas station, and then admitted that they had driven to a deserted parking lot behind it. But in general, these details did not compromise him in any way. The guy did not confess to the murder, and there was a lack of concrete evidence against him. So Mark was released without being charged, although of course he remained the prime suspect. After all, no one believed his story. It was obvious that the girl had been brutally abused before her death. The situation changed radically only after 3 months when the full report of the forensic expert arrived. In the opinion of the specialist, Cayley died as a result of blunt facial and head trauma. So everything that happened was reclassified as intentional murder. On this basis, on February 28, 2018, Mark was arrested and charged with kidnapping, murder, and rape. However, even then, the young man did not admit his guilt, and later he was even released on bail until the start of the trial. It would seem obvious the girl was last with Mark, so he should be held accountable. But the deeper the police delved into the details of the investigation, the more thoroughly they studied the identity of the suspect and the circumstances of the victim's life, the more they revealed a whole tangle of tragic mistakes, fatal coincidences, and misunderstandings that ultimately led Cayley to the forensic experts' table. Mark's relatives and friends immediately hired a lawyer for him to defend the innocent young man in their opinion. The lawyer was convinced that the young man was being unfairly held accountable. The lawyer believed that the charges were the result of the negligence and bias of the investigation. In his view, Mark was not involved in the assault, and the cause of the girl's injuries could have been an ordinary fall at the music festival or two vigorous efforts by doctors during attempts to save her life. The police's work was significantly complicated by the fact that the officers were unable to find anyone who witnessed what happened, despite the fact that everything took place at a crowded concert. The suspect's lawyer insisted that his client could not have committed such a brutal crime because his behavior did not generally correspond to that of a typical murderer. Instead of trying to cover up the evidence and dispose of the body, Mark himself took the victim to the hospital in an attempt to save her. Of course, the defense tried in every way to create as positive an image of their client as possible. Unfortunately, as the prosecution later discovered, an incredibly experienced and influential lawyer was working with the suspect. It was not until December 2019, a full 2 years after the tragedy, that Mark stood trial for the murder of Cayley. From the prosecution's point of view, on October 29, 2017, the defendant forcibly dragged the student into his car, effectively kidnapping her from the music festival. Then he drove her to a deserted parking lot behind a gas station. It was there that Mark, enraged by the argument and jealousy of the other guy, brutally abused Cayley, beating her, raping her, until the girl experienced a brain hemorrhage that caused irreversible consequences. When the victim stopped showing any signs of life, the young man became scared and tried to rectify the situation by getting to the hospital. He really hoped that the doctors would be able to save Cayley. However, in the opinion of the lawyer, this version of the accusation was flawed from beginning to end, starting with the moment of kidnapping and ending with the beatings and rape. The defender appealed to the fact that the prosecution did not have a single direct witness who could confirm the kidnapping, who saw the girl being forcibly placed in the car and taken away from the festival venue. The defense put forward the assumption that the active attempts to save Cayley's life and the intensive resuscitation measures by the doctors could have been the cause of the bruises and other injuries on her body. It was known that the doctors performed indirect heart massage on the girl at least 7 times before realizing the futility of these efforts. Unfortunately, the only person who could confirm or refute Mark's version was dead, and although the lawyer's version about the infliction of injuries by doctors sounded extremely doubtful, the prosecution had to rule out all unlikely scenarios claimed by the defense, and for this, witnesses were needed who could shed light on at least some part of the events of that tragic evening. First of all, the investigators interviewed the paramedics who were on duty at the ambulance and were the first to start rescuing the student. Their crew was standing in the parking lot near the emergency room, waiting for the next call. Suddenly, a car stopped behind them with a wild screech of tires. The driver, waving his arms in panic, called for help. It was Mark Howerton. He quickly led the paramedics to his car and showed them the unconscious Cayley. Mark begged them to save the girl, who had allegedly stopped breathing. When the doctors looked into the car, their vigilance only grew. Naked Cayley was lying in the car, her pants and t-shirt were on the floor. The girl showed no signs of life, and her body was covered in bruises. Even on the inside of her thighs, there were characteristic finger imprints. Cayley was barely breathing, and her pulse was faint. So the doctors immediately began resuscitation measures, artificial respiration, indirect heart massage. A detailed examination of the victim was out of the question at the time her life was at stake. These testimonies of the doctors completely refuted Mark's lie that the bruises appeared on Cayley only after she arrived at the hospital, allegedly from 2 intense resuscitation attempts. After all, everyone who saw the girl during her arrival at the hospital unanimously stated that hematomas had already covered her entire body at that time. Moreover, several witnesses drew attention to Mark's strange appearance. His fists, according to those present, were dirty and red, as if the guy had been fighting with someone for a long time before bringing Cayley to the hospital. It later turned out that Mark was quite muscular and athletic, and he took steroids to increase his muscle mass. And this excessive preoccupation with anabolic steroids, according to his acquaintances, began to provoke sudden mood swings, outbursts of aggression, and uncontrolled fits of rage in the young man. Such a steroid effect could explain the brutal assault on Cayley that evening. The girl may have inadvertently provoked her boyfriend's anger with a careless word or gesture. At first, Mark cooperated quite willingly with the investigation, even allowing his car to be inspected without a warrant. In the car, detectives found a gun and drugs. The defense skillfully used these circumstances to the benefit of their client. The lawyer argued that no one guilty of a serious crime would be so openly cooperative with the police. However, the prosecution quickly saw through this cunning move by the suspect. In their opinion, Mark was deliberately pretending to be innocent and assisting the investigation in every way to deflect any suspicion from himself. The police continued to pressure the guy, and eventually it paid off. They managed to find out that Mark had previously shown aggression towards Cayley. A few weeks before the tragedy, one such conflict ended with a police call. At that time, Cayley simply fled from her enraged boyfriend, who nearly beat her in the dorm. When the law enforcement officers arrived in response to the call, they saw that the room was turned upside down, broken furniture, a smashed laptop, scattered belongings, clothes in the trees outside the window. According to neighbors, Mark caused a terrible mess, but Cayley then withdrew her complaint and asked not to disclose the details. Cayley's friend said that after that incident, the couple's relationship seemed to have ended. Cayley did not want to even talk to Mark and ignored his calls. But later, the former lovers reconciled. During the court hearing, the prosecution demonstrated the couple's personal correspondence. The context of the messages made it clear that Mark reacted very painfully to any hints about a possible breakup. For example, in one of the photos, he was holding a gun to his temple and threatening to kill himself if Cayley did not call him. Thus, Cayley found herself drawn into an extremely dangerous and morbid love triangle. The girl did not dare to completely break up with Mark, fearing that he really might commit suicide, and at the same time, she could not give up her feelings for the other guy, her ex-boyfriend Jett. Cayley herself repeatedly confessed to her friends that she was in love with both of them, which made it so difficult for her to make a choice. At the trial, the prosecution argued that on the eve of the tragedy, in October 2017, Cayley finally decided to break this oppressive bond. It was about this that she informed Jett during the festival. The girl wanted to break up with Mark right after the concert, and until then, she stayed close to him to protect herself from possible aggression in a crowded place. However, as soon as the lovers found themselves alone, the jealous Mark, according to the prosecution's version, forcibly dragged the girl into the car and drove her to a deserted place, where he brutally assaulted her. Unfortunately, the key witness in this case was supposed to be Jett Burcham, Cayley's other boyfriend. And indeed, during the first court hearing, it was thanks to his testimony that the prosecution had grounds to accuse Mark of kidnapping, rape, and murder. But very quickly, the defense managed to discredit Jett's testimony. As it turned out, he was not actually an eyewitness to the kidnapping. Jett did not see firsthand how Mark forcibly put Cayley in his car, although he initially claimed that he had personally witnessed this. This all came to light when the lawyer started cornering the guy, asking him why he did not rush to the girl's aid if he had witnessed the violence. In reality, Cayley and Mark had disappeared from Jett's sight even before that moment. He could not have witnessed their departure, and he was relaying second-hand information, although he was unable to name those people. All of this gave the defense grounds to accuse Jett of false testimony and dealt a devastating blow to the prosecution's case. Their main witness now looked extremely unreliable, which undermined confidence in his words. In addition, during the trial, photos of drugs, suspicious contacts, and correspondence were found on Jett Burcham's mobile phone. This gave grounds to suspect the guy of drug abuse and involvement in drug distribution. It later turned out that at the time of Cayley's death, her ex-boyfriend was on probation. He had previously been arrested for selling marijuana, and among the youth of San Antonio, Jett had a reputation as a well-known dealer. The defense conducted a harsh cross-examination, and at some point, Burcham began to evade answering questions, citing his constitutional rights. For a guy who had cooperated with law enforcement and received immunity from criminal prosecution in exchange for his testimony, such behavior seemed extremely strange. It seemed as though he was afraid of exposing himself in some dubious dealings that were unrelated to Cayley's case. Additionally, Mark's lawyer managed to find out that Jett had previous legal problems. Shortly before the incident with Cayley, he had been expelled from the university for harassing another student who had filed a police report. At that time, Jett was able to settle the conflict by promising to voluntarily leave the educational institution, so the defense openly pressured the jurors, portraying Jett as a real scoundrel, a drug dealer, harasser, and liar. Who would believe such a witness? But the prosecution did not give up. In order to dispel any doubts about the causes of Cayley's death, the prosecution brought in several independent experts. The forensic experts came to an unambiguous conclusion: the head trauma that caused the massive brain hemorrhage and ultimately the girl's death could in no way have been sustained as a result of her short stay in the hospital, as the defense had insisted. The lawyer's version that Cayley had allegedly fallen and hit her head after being hospitalized sounded completely absurd. The girl had lost consciousness even before arriving at the clinic, so all the efforts of the doctors were aimed precisely at trying to revive her. So it was highly unlikely that they would have allowed someone to strike the patient so hard that she sustained a fatal traumatic brain injury. However, several experts brought in by the defense suggested that some of the bruises on the victim's body could have appeared as a result of her preparation for organ donation, a procedure that Cayley herself had insisted on while still alive. Based on data about the nature and location of the injuries, forensic experts used 3D modeling to recreate the circumstances of the attack on the girl. These materials clearly demonstrated to the jurors that Cayley's death was undoubtedly the result of a brutal beating, not an accident or medical negligence. The results of the toxicological examination were also a significant argument for the prosecution. The analysis of Cayley's blood showed a high content of psychoactive substances that increased blood pressure and, consequently, the risk of internal bleeding and rupture of blood vessels. Therefore, Mark's defenders appealed to this fact, saying that with such a cocktail in the body, even a minor head injury could have provoked a fatal brain hemorrhage, which is what happened to the girl. However, the prosecution insisted that this was a case of intentional murder. After all, neither an accidental fall nor a medical error could explain the broken nose, split lip, bruises on the neck, and other characteristic injuries that eloquently testified to the girl's brutal beating. Eventually, after intense and lengthy debates between the parties, the jurors retired to the deliberation room to render a verdict. Just a few hours later, the defense received a shocking phone call. An unexpected witness contacted the lawyer, claiming that he had seen Cayley's condition during her hospitalization. It was a duty nurse from the emergency room where the girl ended up. He assured them that when Cayley was first brought in, there were no bruises on her body. In his opinion, the hematomas could have arisen from internal bleeding due to prolonged cardiac arrests and measures taken to prepare the body for organ removal. Such testimony could have completely cleared Mark Howerton of the charges, but as the judge explained to the lawyer at this stage, it was no longer possible to involve new witnesses. The jury's deliberations lasted more than 10 hours. For 2 days, they were unable to reach a consensus. The court was unable to satisfy the thirst for justice of the deceased girl's relatives. The jurors proved unable to render a unanimous verdict regarding the defendant's guilt. As a result, the court was forced to declare the previous trial improper and schedule a retrial. Despite this interim result, both sides stated that they were ready to continue defending their positions. The defense planned to seek a complete review of the case, including due to Jett Burcham's dishonest testimony and the appearance of a new witness. As for Kayley Mundadee's parents, despite everything, they had no doubts about Mark's guilt. They were determined to continue seeking to hold their daughter's abuser accountable, and very soon their hopes were fulfilled. The prosecution refiled charges against Mark Howerton. In June 2023, a new trial began. This time, it was held behind closed doors without access for the press or outsiders. So many details remained unknown to the general public. Initially, in 2018, the young man faced life in prison. But during the retrial, the qualification of the crime and the measure of punishment were somewhat mitigated. Now Mark was charged with assault under aggravating circumstances, which carried a sentence of up to 20 years in prison. At this stage, the prosecution brought in a new expert, a specialist in domestic violence. He vividly depicted Mark's psychological portrait to the jurors as a classic abuser, a jealous owner who sought by any means to cut off Cayley from all contact with the outside world, intimidated her, humiliated her, threatened her, and eventually could not restrain himself and crippled the girl in a fit of rage. In the expert's opinion, the 19-year-old Cayley, due to her young age and inexperience, simply did not realize who she was dealing with and what danger she was in. As in the previous trial, a heated discussion about the nature of Cayley's injuries unfolded in the courtroom. The defense was still unable to involve the new witness in the case, that same nurse who allegedly saw the girl's condition before the bruises appeared. Therefore, the prosecution's version turned out to be more convincing. Eventually, despite all the objections and attempts to play on the jurors' sympathies, Mark lost. He was found guilty and sentenced to the maximum term of 20 years in prison. Such is the sad and instructive story of Kayley Mundadee. A very young, inexperienced girl, blinded by love, failed to notice that her chosen one was a dangerous and unpredictable type. The one who swore to love and protect her turned out to be a real monster, and it cost Cayley her life. Let this tragedy serve as a warning to all of us. Be cautious and careful in relationships. Do not ignore warning signs. Remember, if someone truly loves you, they will never express their feelings through rudeness, control, threats, or blackmail. These are signs of an unhealthy relationship that you need to get out of immediately. Unfortunately, Cayley and her relatives did not attach importance to these red flags. The girl believed that she could tame her chosen one's evil temper and appealed to his common sense. But someone who is used to pressuring and intimidating rarely stops on their own. That is why victims of violence should seek help as soon as possible. Nowadays in the USA, as in many other countries, there is an entire system to protect and support victims of domestic abuse. Crisis centers, hotlines, community organizations operate. The police, courts, and social services are all called upon to protect the vulnerable and prevent such tragedies. I hope this story will make many people think, and perhaps it will even save someone's life. Never be ashamed to ask for help if you feel a real threat, and do not be indifferent if you see someone nearby become a victim of violence. Timely intervention and compassion can work wonders, and perhaps somewhere now they will help save another Cayley from a fatal mistake.